Chapter 639. In the house next to the horse-washing bridge, Old Ma looked a bit restless. He was sitting on the edge of the bed in the bedroom, and on the bed, White Lotus was still lying there with her eyes closed. Close by, the green chain on her neck was still shining. The house was very quiet, the door was unlatched, and the window was half open. From there, he could see the scenery of the courtyard. From where Old Ma was sitting, he could see the black dog lying under the big tree in the courtyard. It had a lazy and bored look, and its eyes were slightly closed, as if it was going to fall asleep soon. Old Ma felt a bit nervous. He thought that it was mostly because of the importance of the tree branch. As for other things, it was quiet here. There was nothing worth being vigilant about. As for White Lotus, he subconsciously looked down. The beautiful young girl looked like a flower that was about to wither. His hand that was reaching for the branch paused slightly in midair. Finally, he clenched his teeth and touched it. His somewhat stubby fingers reached into the soft green light, causing his body to slightly tremble. But after pausing for a moment, nothing unexpected happened. Old Ma looked at White Lotus, frowned, and then used his fingers to lightly grab the branch. When he touched the skin, he felt a cool water like chill pass through his fingertips. It wasn't a very stimulating kind of cold, just a feeling that was a bit colder than the temperature of water. Even so, wearing this kind of necklace would definitely not be comfortable, unless one had an innate cold resistance, or if one's cultivation was too high and long ago ignored this little bit of cold. Old Ma used his fingers to gently stroke the lifelike branch a few times. After a moment of silence, his eyes flashed, and he looked down again. White Lotus was still lying there motionless like before, as if she was no longer a threat to him. Everything here was decided by him alone. The light in the depths of his eyes suddenly flourished, as if he had made up his mind. His body slightly leaned forward, and just as he was about to do something, woof! Suddenly, a cry fiercely broke the silence in the bedroom. Even though it didn't sound loud, but in this silence, it was like a sudden clap of thunder. A clap of thunder in the clear sky. Old Ma's body violently trembled, and he staggered, almost falling down. If he hadn't instinctively stretched out his hand to support himself on the bed, he would have been so scared that he would have directly thrown himself onto White Lotus's body. Even so, his unintentional forward movement almost touched White Lotus's body. His face was only a little distance away from White Lotus's face. This really made Old Ma's heart almost jump out of his chest. But luckily, White Lotus still didn't seem to have any signs of waking up, or else this situation would be really too embarrassing. A delicate fragrance from the young girl drifted into Old Horse's nose. It was like an orchid deep in the mountains. Although it was quiet and plain, its fragrance was distant and could stir one's heart. For a moment, Old Ma's gaze actually froze for a moment. He had never looked at a girl at such a close distance, not to mention White Lotus, who was so beautiful that she was even qualified to be the first in a 1,000-year-old family like the Kunlun party. She was supposed to be a high and unattainable woman like a snow lotus, but suddenly, it was as if she was right under his body and close at hand. Old Ma was a little dazed, and his mind suddenly became a little chaotic and blank. He actually forgot what he wanted to do before, and even forgot why the current situation had become like this. But fortunately, although his mind was temporarily confused, there was a dog in the room whose mind was 10 times clearer than his. The black dog, who was not the slightest bit affected by the temptation of beauty, saw Old Ma's inexplicable loss of self-control. After the initial surprise and doubt, it quickly ran over, stood beside the bed, and loudly barked into Old Ma's ear. Old Ma's body trembled, and he cried out in alarm. This time he was quite frightened, but not entirely out of fear. There was also an inexplicable sense of shame. His body slanted a little, and he jumped up. He took 2 steps back, and then looked at Atsu angrily and said, "You stupid dog, what are you doing? You stupid dog, what are you doing?" Atsu glanced at Old Ma and did not say anything, but the way it looked at Old Ma looked a little strange. Old Horse was not Luchan. He did not know the dog as well as Luchan did. He could completely understand what the dog meant without saying a word. Therefore, after mumbling a few words, Old Horse still walked over. But this time, he did not dare to do anything more. After a moment of silence, he said to Atsu, "I have a use for that chain." Atsu looked at him, not knowing if it was difficult to determine what he was thinking, but in the end, it still stepped back. Old Ma secretly breathed a sigh of relief in his heart, and then walked to White Lotus. After calming down this time without hesitation, he reached out and directly grabbed the chain on White Lotus's neck. Then, with a low groan, he exerted force in his hand, and with a snap, the chain broke. He pulled the branch necklace off White Lotus's neck. When Lu Chen walked to the house at Shima Qiao, he heard Atsu's call from the door. It seemed that they were really here. Lu Chen's heart was relieved. Walking all the way from the door to the backyard, Lu Chen immediately saw Old Ma coming out from the bedroom, and at the same time, Atsu followed behind him. Lu Chen walked over and shouted, "Old Ma, how is White Lotus?" At first, Old Ma seemed to be preoccupied and lost in thought. He didn't even notice Lu Chen's figure appearing on the other side of the yard. Until Lu Chen came over and shouted, Old Ma was suddenly startled. His body shook, and he looked up to see Lu Chen. His face showed a bit of shock and a slightly panicked expression. Why did you come so quickly?" "Quickly?" Lu Chen asked with a little doubt and said, "It's okay. How is White Lotus?" Old Ma hesitated for a moment, turned around and pointed to the bedroom, and said, "She hasn't woken up yet. She is lying on the bed." Lu Chen nodded, walked over and patted Old Ma's shoulder, and said casually, "I will go in and see her. This time. Thanks to you for saving her life. When she wakes up, you have to ask her to repay you." Old Ma was startled and said, "Repay what?" Lu Chen looked at him strangely and said, "Anything, you can say whatever you want to say. Also, you won't really say anything excessive to her, will you?" Old Ma thought for a moment and said no. Lu Chen laughed and walked into the bedroom. Behind him, Old Ma looked at his back with a complicated expression, while the black dog stood at the side, looking at Old Ma, and then at Lu Chen, not saying a word. No one knew what the dog was thinking. Lu Chen walked into the room, and immediately saw White Lotus. Then he thought of the troubles he had worried about before, and then his eyes moved down slightly, looking at White Lotus's neck. Chapter 640. Since you're here, I'll go out for a walk and get some fresh air. Standing behind Lu Chen, Old Ma yawned, looking a little tired, and said, "I've been locked up here for half a day. It's a little stuffy." Lu Chen sat on the edge of the bed with his back facing him, looking at White Lotus, as if he was carefully observing her expression. After a moment of silence, he didn't turn around and said in a very flat tone, "Okay." Old Ma turned around and walked out. Just when he walked to the door and was about to step out, with his back facing Lu Chen, a strange and complicated expression finally appeared on his face. Suddenly, he heard Lu Chen suddenly call out from behind him, "Old Ma." Old Ma's heart skipped a beat, and his feet slowly landed on the ground, raising some dust and making a low sound. "What's wrong?" He smiled and turned around, asking Lu Chen's back. Lu Chen still didn't look back at him, still staring at the unconscious White Lotus lying on the bed, as if all his attention was still on the girl. At the same time, he said to Old Ma in a very flat and casual tone, "When you come back later, bring some good wine and dishes. We haven't had a drink together for a long time." Old Ma breathed a sigh of relief, a smile appeared on his face, and he scolded with a smile. "What are you talking about? We haven't had a drink because you've made a meteoric rise, haven't you? It's a small matter, leave it to me." After saying that, he seemed to feel a little funny, laughed twice, and strode out. The room was quiet again, and no one knew when Atsu disappeared from this room, and no one knew where he went in the blink of an eye. In such a big house, it gradually gave people a feeling of emptiness, as if in such a big place, only this bedroom had a little vitality left. The anger came from the two people in the room, Lu Chen and White Lotus, who looked like a dead person but was still alive. Lu Chen quietly stared at White Lotus. His eyes looked very calm, and there was almost no strange expression on his face. His whole person seemed very calm and collected. Most of the time, his gaze landed on Bai Lian's fair neck in a strange manner. Even though there were times when he would shift his gaze away to look at other parts of her body in order to check on her injuries, he would quickly turn his gaze back to her. To be honest, it wasn't very polite for a man to stare at a girl's neck like this. If White Lotus was still awake, she would probably get angry. However, she was the one who was unconscious. Perhaps she didn't feel anything from the outside world, so she naturally didn't have any reaction. Lu Chen's gaze gradually became a bit deep and complicated. In this silence, he seemed to be thinking or judging something in his mind, and the expression on his face didn't look too good. After a moment, suddenly Lu Chen stretched out his hand, and this time directly placed it on the side of White Lotus's neck. He carefully touched the edge of her clothes a few times. This action, of course, was a bit excessive, and even crossed the line. In the midst of this, Lu Chen's fingers even directly touched the soft skin of White Lotus. At the edge of her clothes and even near her collarbone, he continuously pressed a few times, as if he was finally confirming something. After a while, he slowly straightened his body and expressionlessly stood up. He had already obtained his answer. The tree branch necklace that White Lotus used to wear was now gone, and on the originally white, soft and even perfect skin, there was a small inconspicuous spot on the side and back of an inconspicuous place. There was a small inconspicuous faint red. It was like the blush that a girl's cheeks would have when she was shy, or as if she had just been lightly shaved. Lu Chen stood by the bed for a while, slightly frowning as he pondered. His hand hung by his side, calm and harmless. From this place, it wasn't very far from White Lotus, who was lying on the bed. He only needed to bend down slightly, and this hand could once again return to the girl's neck. The beautiful girl slept quietly, as if she didn't know that there was such a hand beside her that could snap her neck at any time. The room was abnormally quiet, and one could even vaguely hear a strange sound in the extreme silence. It sounded like a person's heartbeat, but when one listened carefully, the sound disappeared, as if it was just an illusion. Lu Chen stood there for a long time. At some point, he suddenly sighed softly, shook his head, and left the bedside. He walked to the door and looked out. Looking at the empty courtyard, he suddenly whistled loudly. The whistle broke the somewhat strange and uncomfortable silence, like a blade piercing a piece of white paper. After a while, a sudden bark rang out. From another corner of the room, the black dog scuttled out and trotted all the way back to Lu Chen's side. Lu Chen smiled. He didn't mind the dirt and sat directly on the doorsill. Then he hugged Atsu's head and stroked it hard. His eyes flickered as he said, "Stay here with me and wait for old Ma to come back." Atsu looked at him, and then obediently lay on the ground beside him. Lu Chen didn't say anything else. He just sat there and waited patiently. Time passed slowly. The light and shadow in the sky flickered, and the reflection in the room was also constantly changing. In the light and shadow, Lu Chen's face remained motionless like a statue, as if he had hidden all his emotions. Old Ma still didn't come back. When the sky gradually darkened and night finally fell, the house fell into darkness in the silence. Even Lu Chen's figure was swallowed by the surging darkness, but old Ma still didn't come back. Lu Chen had been sitting on the doorsill for a long time. He seemed to be particularly patient today, or perhaps there was an unusual desire in his heart that allowed him to sit there and wait for his friend. The food and wine he promised, the drinks he promised, had yet to come true. The sky was dark, and Atsu had already fallen asleep. There was some snoring, as if it was laughing at Lu Chen's ridiculous persistence. Lu Chen looked up at the quiet night sky, and for a moment he was also in a trance. He took one last look at the quiet courtyard, stood up silently, and walked back to the bedroom. Bang! He slammed the door. Atsu was still sleeping, and seemed to turn a deaf ear to this sound. Pada! Lu Chen lit a candle in the room, and then walked to White Lotus, who had not woken up until now. He picked up one of her hands and checked it. He found that her pulse was stable, and the injuries on her body seemed to be improving. It seemed that her life was not in danger. What was strange was that the culprit that had been raging in her body, the tyrannical spiritual power, seemed to have been completely cleansed. Although the power of the spiritual power had been greatly weakened, it had completely calmed down and hid quietly in the sea of Qi and White Lotus's dantian. It seemed that as long as it was given time, it would even show signs of merging with White Lotus's own spiritual power. This was the effect of the blood food secret method. Lu Chen was well aware of this. He glanced at White Lotus and smiled slightly, but the smile was slightly sarcastic. "I don't know if you heard what the damn Baldy said." He said, "You dare to eat such a deadly thing." Chapter 641. The candlelight burned silently, lighting up the only source of light in the darkness, shining on the two of them. Lu Chen stared at White Lotus, his expression gradually becoming complicated and emotional. Then he casually sat down next to White Lotus and said to himself, "When you wake up, what will you do? The world is big, but there is no place to stand, and you don't want to die. This is probably torture." White Lotus lay motionless and didn't respond to his words. Lu Chen also didn't seem to care. He glanced at White Lotus's neck and then said in a low voice, "Is he the one who took that branch?" The dim candlelight fell on White Lotus's beautiful face, and the room fell into silence. After a while, Lu Chen quietly pulled the quilt on White Lotus's body higher and covered her neck. Then he turned and walked out of the room. Lu Chen left the house next to the horse washing bridge and took Atsu with him when he left. In other words, he left the unconscious White Lotus alone in this dark and uninhabited house. If someone came near, White Lotus would have no way to resist. This method was obviously not very appropriate, but Lu Chen did it. Moreover, when he left, he didn't have the slightest hesitation, as if he wasn't worried about the person in the house behind him. Taking advantage of the darkness of the night, he walked through the long street and the mountain path, returning to Mount Celestial Dragon. Then he walked all the way to the Fuyun Agency's territory. After glancing at the deep darkness of the night, he calmly walked into the Kunlun Palace where true Lord Tianlan was. In the dead of night, even though it wouldn't matter if Supreme Tianlan sat here for a few days and nights with his cultivation, he naturally wouldn't stay here under normal circumstances. In fact, the security outside the Kunlun Hall was also very tight. Only Lu Chen, with his unique identity, could come and disturb Supreme Tianlan at this time. He entered the hall and at the same time, a message was quickly sent. Lu Chen didn't know and didn't want to know what the damned Baldy was doing at this moment. He only said one simple thing in the message. "There's an urgent matter, come out and talk." When the boy who went in to report left, he looked at Lu Chen with a complicated expression. He seemed to be crying. Even a deity transformation stage Supreme wouldn't be in a good mood to be disturbed in the middle of the night. No, it should be said that if a deity transformation stage Supreme was angry, that would be even more frightening. Unfortunately, Lu Chen did not respond to his pleading eyes. After entering the hall, he simply sat down on a chair, obviously waiting for perfected Lord Tianlan to come out and speak. The boy sighed deeply and left with a hidden bitterness in his eyes. After a while, the boy ran out of the back hall with an excited expression, as if he had just escaped from death. He smiled and said to Lu Chen, "Young master, Supreme Tianlan will be here soon. He asked you to wait here for a while." Lu Chen nodded and said very politely, "Okay, thank you." The boy grunted and said, "There's no need to be so polite. I just want to trouble young master. We can do anything in the future, but please try not to come here so late at night." As he spoke, he looked at Lu Chen pitifully. Lu Chen felt a little embarrassed under his gaze. He smiled and nodded, saying, "Just this once." The boy went away happily. Not long after, the sound of footsteps was heard. It was Supreme Tianlan coming out of the back hall. Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't look angry at all, as if it was no different from daytime to him. He even smiled at Lu Chen and asked, "What's the matter? Why are you in such a hurry?" Lu Chen had already stood up when he saw him. Without any hesitation, he said straightforwardly, "I may know the whereabouts of the branch of the Devil Sex Divine Tree." Supreme Tianlan was startled, as if he didn't expect to hear this news from Lu Chen. He looked at him with interest and said, "You actually know this news? Then tell me." With that, he sat down on a chair next to him and beckoned Lu Chen to sit next to him. Lu Chen didn't intend to sit down. Instead, he stood and began to narrate the matter in the most direct and simple words. In the end, he said, "I guess that the thing on White Lotus's neck should be that branch. I went there today to make a final confirmation, but the branch disappeared when I reached Horse Washing Bridge." Supreme Tianlan's expression didn't change. His eyes were deep. After pondering for a moment, he said, "So you suspect that Old Ma took that branch?" Lu Chen said, "There's no one else but him." Most of the people in the world didn't know much about the devil cult, and they had never heard of the highest secret of the devil cult like the fragment of the divine tree. However, Old Ma was the same as me. He knew everything about the devil cult. He can recognize that thing, and he didn't return for a whole night probably, because he was confused by that branch. That's why he ran away in the night. Supreme Tianlan nodded slowly and said after a while, "Since you said so, I naturally believe in your judgment. What's your plan now?" Luchin said, "My plan is to find you now and tell you about the matter. You decide how to deal with it." Supreme Tianlan looked at him deeply, a light flashing in the depths of his eyes. After a while, he stood up and walked to the door of the hall. He said indifferently to someone outside, "Call Schwering over right now." Someone outside immediately agreed. Then there was the sound of disorderly footsteps, and someone hurriedly left. Supreme Tianlan looked up at the night sky with his hands behind his back. After a long time, he turned around and slowly walked back to Luchin. He said, "Aren't you and Ma Xiaoyan best friends for many years? Why did you do this today?" Luchin looked up at him and answered without asking, "Do you think I did something wrong?" Supreme Tianlan thought for a while and said, "No, you did the right thing." He seemed to say it sincerely. "If it were me, I would probably do the same." After saying that, he sighed with a faint disappointment on his face. It was unknown whether it was for himself or for Luchin. Some things couldn't be hidden. White Lotus wasn't dead yet. As long as she woke up, this matter would definitely be exposed. As long as she made a big deal of this matter, Supreme Tianlan might realize that Luchin might have seen this necklace a long time ago, but didn't tell him. When Old Ma left the bedroom, Luchin didn't look back at him, but he called out to him. At that time, did Luchin want Old Ma to stay, or did he want him to take the branch and run away? Luchin didn't think about this question at all, and didn't want to think about it. He didn't want to know the answer. He only knew that Old Ma had left him for that very important evil cult treasure. Knowing this should be enough, right? As he thought this, he seemed to feel something at the same time. He looked back and saw Shuang walking in from the door of the hall. But she wasn't alone. What was rare was that there was another person following behind her. This was rare when she came to Supreme Tianlan's place. But soon, the eyes of everyone in the hall lit up and stared at the face of the person behind Schwering. He was a little fat and looked a little familiar. He walked honestly and didn't raise his head. But Supreme Tianlan and Luchin immediately recognized that this person was Old Ma. Chapter 642. Seeing the two people who had just entered slowly walk over with steady footsteps. The great hall of Kunlun was silent for a moment. Luchin looked at Old Ma, while True Lord Tianlan turned his head to look at Luchin. Luchin could feel True Lord Tianlan's gaze on him. He didn't even need to look at the damn Baldy's eyes to feel the astonishment, surprise, and even a bit of mockery in his eyes. He knew what this damn Baldy was thinking. He knew that right now, True Lord Tianlan wanted to preserve some dignity for himself, as well as maintain some dignity in front of Shui Ying and the others. That was why he wasn't laughing to his heart's content. Although it was soundless, he seemed to be able to hear that laughter. The most inexplicable thing was that Luchin actually guessed that this damn Baldy probably knew that Luchin could understand his thoughts, so he was pretending to laugh in his heart. This was an inexplicable intuition that didn't make any sense. However, when Luchin silently turned his head to look at True Lord Tianlan, and saw this damn Baldy's unprecedentedly serious expression, as well as the light that constantly flickered in his eyes, Luchin knew that his guess was probably correct. This feeling of telepathy was really embarrassing to the point of wanting to die. Shuang brought Old Ma to the front. True Lord Tianlan's sleeves moved slightly as he looked at the two of them. Shuang stepped forward to greet them, and Old Ma knelt down as well. True Lord Tianlan's expression didn't change, as if he had suddenly forgotten that he had called Shuang over for an urgent matter. He only nodded lightly and said, "You've come." Shuang solemnly bowed to True Lord Tianlan, then stood up and said with a respectful expression, "My lord, I have a guess as to why you summoned me here in the middle of the night. However, before you speak, I also have an urgent matter to report." True Lord Tianlan nodded and said, "No problem, you go first." Shuang stepped to the side, revealing Old Ma's figure. She then said, "Fuyunji's former Shadow Patrol Inspector Ma Xiaoyan has something to report to you." Both true Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen could tell that Shuang had deliberately emphasized the first 5 words in her simple words. She was probably emphasizing her identity. Supreme Lord Tianlan couldn't help glancing at Lu Chen out of the corner of his eye. Lu Chen stood aside expressionlessly, looking as unresponsive as a wooden man. Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes flickered with a faint smile. Go ahead. Without saying a word, Old Ma took 2 steps forward on his knees. Suddenly, he reached into his bosom and took out a box. He presented it to Supreme Lord Tianlan with both hands and said loudly, "My lord, by chance, I have recently obtained one of the 4 fragments of the Devil Sect's legendary Tree of God, the Tree of God's branch. I dare not covet such a precious treasure, so I have specially come to offer it to you." His words were resolute and full of vigor, showing his loyalty. Supreme Lord Tianlan seemed to be moved. He nodded and said, "There's such a thing?" Old Ma said, "Yes, the treasure is in this box. Please have a look, my lord." Supreme Lord Tianlan casually waved his hand, and the box in Old Ma's hand flew into his. After weighing it in his hand, Supreme Lord Tianlan opened the lid. At that moment, a green light shone out from the box. It flowed and swayed, carrying a strange aura of life. It was a spiritual power that almost no living creature in the world could possess. Legend had it that only the 4 fragments of the Devil Sect possessed it. It was the aura of the Tree of God. Lu Chen recognized that it was the real Tree of God's branch, and so did Supreme Lord Tianlan. At that moment, even with his calmness, he couldn't help but smile happily. He nodded and said, Good. Little Ma, you have made a great contribution." Old Ma kowtowed, and then stood up silently. He walked to Shuang and stood behind her. He lowered his head and lowered his arms, staring at the ground. Lu Chen looked at his old friend with a complicated expression. After a while he sighed softly. Seeing Supreme Lord Tianlan smiling and playing with the Tree of God necklace in his hand, Shuang also walked forward and said with a smile, "My lord, are you satisfied with this treasure?" Supreme Lord Tianlan smiled and said, "Very good." Shuang smiled and pointed at Old Ma. She said, "Please tell me, how should I reward this person?" Supreme Lord Tianlan chuckled. His eyes flickered as he glanced at Lu Chen. His expression didn't change as he said generously, "This item is of great use to me. Little Ma, you have done well and made a great contribution. How about this, from today onwards, Ma Xiaoyan will be promoted to Deputy Hall Master of Fuyunji. He will assist Shuang in managing the affairs of the shadow. This can be considered his old profession." Shuang was slightly startled. She then smiled and nodded in agreement. Old Ma had already knelt down to express his thanks. After a short delay and a few more words, Shuang and Old Ma stood up and left. Supreme Lord Tianlan didn't ask them to stay. However, before Shuang left, she turned around and asked Supreme Lord Tianlan, "My lord, you said that you called me over for an urgent matter. I wonder if I still have." She didn't finish her sentence, but there was a questioning look in her eyes and expression. Supreme Lord Tianlan laughed and waved his hand. He said, "What urgent matter? It's fine. You can go." Shuang smiled like a flower. She nodded in agreement. Then, she left the hall with Old Ma. Before she left, she seemed to deliberately look at Lu Chen. There was a meaningful look in her eyes. Lu Chen was speechless. He only clenched his fists that were hidden in his sleeves. After Shuang and Old Ma left, only Supreme Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen were left in the Hall of Kunlun. The atmosphere returned to a somewhat awkward silence. Supreme Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Chen. He didn't say anything. Instead, he clicked his tongue from time to time. Lu Chen couldn't take it anymore. He glared at him and scolded. "What are you clucking at? Look at your gloating face." Supreme Lord Tianlan laughed and pointed at Lu Chen. "Are you a good-for-nothing? You don't have many capable subordinates. Now your most trusted one has run away?" Lu Chen was about to retort. Suddenly he felt a chill in his heart. Although he said it as if he was joking, was there any truth in it? Supreme Lord Tianlan laughed for a while. Then he said in a softer voice, "I believe you also know that I can't refuse my reward just now." Lu Chen nodded slightly. He didn't have any objection to this. As the leader of a powerful force, He could act arbitrarily and be domineering. However, he couldn't act recklessly when it came to rewards. No matter what he thought in private, Old Ma had given him such an important treasure. It was of great significance to Supreme Lord Tianlan. He might even be able to continue his secret plan without having to deal with another divine transformation stage perfected cultivator. This alone was worth the position of a deputy hall master in Fuyunji. But why? Supreme Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Chen with a faint smile. Did you fall out with Ma Xiaoran recently? No. Lu Chen sighed and answered gloomily. Then he asked himself in his heart, why is that? Chapter 643. From Lu Chen's point of view, no matter how he thought about it, he could not figure out why Old Ma would suddenly turn his back on him and stand on Shui Ying's side for no apparent reason. In fact, at this moment, his heart was filled with doubts. There were almost no emotions such as anger or even killing intent for revenge. If he had to list them himself, Lu Chen could tell Old Ma that he was stronger than Shui Ying and that his future prospects were better. At least 10 or 20 reasons would not be a problem. And Lu Chen himself believed that Old Ma was not a fool. He could see that true Lord Tianlan was cultivating Lu Chen as his successor, intentionally or unintentionally. In such a good situation, Old Ma had actually abandoned him, jumped off his ship, and boarded someone else's ship. There could only be one meaning. That guy did not seem to be optimistic about Lu Chen. Lu Chen knew Old Ma very well and trusted him very much. It could even be said that Old Ma was the person he trusted the most. So when this happened, although he did not show it on the surface, he was still surprised and a little suspicious about his situation. Could it be that he had overlooked something? Could it be that he had made a big mistake without knowing it? He shut himself in the quiet room and thought about it carefully for a while. He went through all the things that had happened during this period of time in his mind. In the end, Lu Chen found that although he had met a lot of people and things these days, and did not do everything perfectly, he basically did not make any mistakes. That would really be a ghost. After Lu Chen confirmed that there should be no major problems on his side, he began to doubt Old Ma's intelligence. Was that guy really stupid? For most people on Sky Dragon Mountain, Old Ma was not a person worth paying attention to. Even within Fuyunji, in the past, Old Ma was remembered as a person who followed behind Lu Chen all day long. He could be considered as one of the few subordinates of this true lord's successor. Lu Chen was in the limelight and his prestige was growing day by day. But Old Ma had always been very low-key. Almost no one could feel his existence. Because of this, Old Ma's switch did not cause too much of a stir in Zhengxianming, and even in Fuyunji. Many people did not even know about it. However, within Fuyunji, especially within the small circle of the core, Old Ma's decision to jump ship was like a sudden clap of thunder, strongly stimulating a group of people. This meant a lot. First of all, Lu Chen's closest confidant had betrayed him. This must mean that there was something wrong with Lu Chen's current situation. Everyone could think of this. After all, even Lu Chen himself could not help thinking about it after knowing about Old Ma's action, to see if he had done anything wrong. In addition, there was another very important piece of news, which was that Lord Tianlan generously rewarded Old Ma with a position as the deputy chief of Fuyunji. Although the actual power of Old Ma had not been determined, this gesture had already explained a lot. Lord Tianlan actually approved of Old Ma's betrayal, even though he had jumped ship with Lord Tianlan's only disciple Lu Chen. Did this mean that Lord Tianlan's attitude towards his disciple had also changed a little? Because the matter of the Tree of God's branch fragment was very important. It was not actually leaked out. Everyone only saw those superficial things. Whether it was Lord Tianlan, Lu Chen, Shui Ying, or even Old Ma himself, none of them would come forward to explain anything. Thus, amidst the flabbergasted cries, Lu Chen's originally great situation had inexplicably begun to show signs of being shaken by the wind and rain again. The Immortal City was the largest city in the world. It had a large population and was flourishing. Even at night, the lights at night were abnormally bright and beautiful, so much so that the night view of the Immortal City had also become a popular and famous scenery. The best place in the world to watch the night view of the Immortal City was on Mount Celestial Dragon beside the Immortal City. Every night when the moon was bright and the stars were sparse, standing on the high peak and looking down, one could see the huge city shrouded in the night sky. The lights were bright and dazzling, illuminating the night like the most precious jewels in the world, emitting a dazzling light that was intoxicating. There were not many people who could enjoy such a beautiful and rare scenery. Most of the time, only the people in Zhengxianmeng who occupied Mount Celestial Dragon had the right to do so. At the same time, some of the best scenic spots had long been occupied by the big shots in Zhengxianmeng, so there were not many good spots left to watch. Even if there were, it would be in some dangerous and high places that even cultivators did not like to go to. That night, Lu Chen brought Atu to a mountain peak that was deserted but had a good view. He brought some wine with him, and as he enjoyed the night view of the beautiful night view, he drank the wine. He looked very happy. The wind on the mountain was very strong, but the black dog did not respond to it at all. This dog's physique seemed to be rapidly evolving into the legendary divine beast. Even Lu Chen could feel the fierce undercurrent under the calmness. He thought that it was probably time for Atsu to return to the Great Snow Mountain soon. Vanity Fair. Lu Chen took a big gulp of wine, and seemed to feel a little cold. He hugged Atsu and felt the warmth under the thick and soft fur. He rubbed his face comfortably and then murmured, "Atsu, do you know that below us is the world's biggest Vanity Fair?" Atsu looked back at him. Although this dog had become a little abnormal recently, it still did not seem to understand the word Vanity Fair. Lu Chen did not bother to explain to it. He just stared at the lights at the foot of the mountain. After a while he suddenly said, "In fact, I am almost the same as him. At the beginning, all I wanted was to survive. Later, the situation gradually changed and I got more things. In the end, even the damn Baldy had to protect me and give me such a big piece of cake." He smiled slightly self-deprecatingly and said, "Atsu, do you like eating cake?" Woof. Atsu stared at Lu Chen and shook its head firmly and solemnly. It seemed a little afraid that its crafty master, Lu Chen, would replace the monster meat with cake in the future. Lu Chen rolled his eyes at it, spread out his hands, and said, "So now that I think about it, I can't blame old Ma, because in fact, even I have changed." He looked at the brightly lit city at the foot of the mountain and said, "Who doesn't want fame and fortune? It's good to have fame and fortune. If you can be a person above others, you can enjoy all the happiness in the world. Isn't this what people want in their life? Who is willing to follow behind others and be a minion for the rest of their life? Seeing that you have a bright future, do you want to be buried for the rest of your life?" "Why should I?" Lu Chen asked in a low voice. No one knew whether he was asking himself or Atsu, but Atsu did not seem to have any intention to answer. It raised its head and looked at the clear night sky. Suddenly, its eyes became serious, and it looked into the distance. Then it suddenly shouted and roared. Lu Chen was shocked. He raised his head and looked in the direction that Atsu was looking at. In the distant sky, in the darkness of the night, a red light suddenly appeared. Chapter 644. The Blood Sea anomaly that shrouded the sky above the immortal city, and the hearts of many people in Zhengxianmeng, suddenly arrived in a very unusual way. Of course, in fact, the Blood Sea anomaly itself was an unusual thing. Otherwise it would not be called an anomaly. However, this time, it was also the last Blood Sea anomaly that people expected. Even compared to the previous Blood Sea anomalies, it seemed very strange. First of all, it came earlier than most people thought. The feeling it gave people was, it hasn't been that long. Why is the last Blood Sea anomaly coming already? However, if one carefully recalled the time when the Blood Sea anomaly appeared in the past, one would find that the interval between each Blood Sea anomaly was indeed getting shorter and shorter. It was just that the interval in the past was still long, so it was not particularly obvious. It was not as shocking as the last Blood Sea anomaly. Of course, it was also possible that they knew in advance that this was the last Blood Sea anomaly. Something bad should happen, so the impact on people's hearts was greater. In addition to the time, the scene of the last Blood Sea anomaly was also completely different from the previous times. There was no longer the rolling waves of the Blood Sea that swept across the sky, no longer the dark red blood curtain that instantly covered the entire clear sky, and no longer the insufferably arrogant aura that engulfed the world when the Blood Sea anomaly appeared in the past. From the beginning, the Blood Sea in the sky seemed to have been resisted. Yes, from the very beginning, the Sea of Blood phenomenon didn't progress very smoothly, as if it was being resisted by some mysterious power. As a result, the Sea of Blood in the sky couldn't completely spread out. At the edge of the enormous celestial city, it was extremely difficult for the Sea of Blood to advance, and it even spread out to the sides. That night, Lu Chen and Atu, who had been standing at the peak of Mount Celestial Dragon, had witnessed the entire scene very clearly. They had witnessed the entire process from the appearance of the Blood Sea to its subsequent changes. At the same time, on Mount Celestial Dragon, Lu Chen was not the only one who sensed the appearance of the Blood Sea and observed this scene from various places. In Kunlun Palace Hall, Heavenly Law Hall, Starry Hall, Dezayuan and many other places, there were people quietly looking up at the sky this night, watching the arrival of this last Blood Sea phenomenon. When the mortals woke up in the morning, they would feel that the sky seemed to be slightly darker than usual. When they walked out of the house and looked up at the sky, what appeared in front of them was a strange sky. The sky was still the same sky, at least the sky above their heads was still the same. However, at the edge of the immortal city, a huge circle pattern appeared in the sky, and the surging Blood Sea still appeared in the sky. It drowned every inch of space in the sky visible to the naked eye, except for the top of the immortal city. It was as if this magical and huge city suddenly emitted some kind of powerful force on this day, blocking the evil Blood Sea outside the door. However, the Blood Sea refused to retreat, and still lingered outside the door very fiercely, besieging, crashing, and slowly nibbling away the originally intact sky inch by inch, pushing inwards bit by bit. The originally intact sky was only left in the huge circle above the immortal city, and within the range visible to the naked eye, the dark red color at the edge was still pushing inwards. Things were changing. As the only successor of perfected Lord Tianlan, a core figure in the system of Fuyunji, Lu Chen quickly and nimbly received some news, and felt the undercurrent surging under the calm in Zhangxianmeng. This time, it seemed to be really different from before. Most of the cultivators in Zhangxianmeng were still dismissive of the strange phenomenon in the sky, at least on the surface. Everyone looked very calm, and everyone believed that man could conquer nature. Anyway, even if the sky collapsed, there were still 6 perfected lords of the divine transformation realm to hold it up. They were not afraid, and since they did not leave, what did they have to be afraid of? Fear came from ignorance. For example, the mortals in the immortal city at the foot of the mountain, each and every one of them dragged their families and fled desperately, wanting to leave the most prosperous city in the world as soon as possible. It was extremely ridiculous. Of course, at this time, there were also some impatient cultivators who wanted to know the opinions and attitudes of the few big shots. However, from the beginning of the strange phenomenon in the sky until now, all the perfected lords of the divine transformation realm had been silent. They did not come out to boost the morale, saying that it was just a change in the sky, nor did they come out to warn the crowd that it was very dangerous, and that everyone should run for their lives. They did not come out to tell the crowd that they should not be afraid, and that they were here to hold everything up. In short, they seemed to have suddenly lost their voices, living silently in those tall and magnificent palaces, without saying a word. This was of course a very puzzling thing. Many people did not dare to say much on the surface, but in private, there were many speculations, but not to the extent of how bad it was. In fact, most of them were actually conspiracy theories. Based on past experience, everyone suspected that these few big shots were probably scheming against each other again, preparing to fight for power and profit, and kill everyone in a sea of blood, and so on and so forth. Lu Chen knew that what they said above was bullshit, because as the person closest to perfected Lord Tianlan, he saw with his own eyes that Mount Sky Dragon, which had been relatively stable for the first 3 days of the strange phenomenon of the Blood Sea, began to become chaotic on the 4th day. The Blood Sea was still pressing in step by step, slowly pressing into the center. The area of the normal sky in the sky was getting smaller and smaller. Everyone knew that in the end, the Blood Sea would definitely devour everything. When that time came, who knew what would happen? On the night of the 4th day, It was a cold and mournful night. Lu Chen was the only one who was asked to stay by perfected Lord Tianlan to accompany him. Lu Chen asked the Dambaldi why he asked him to stay, and perfected Lord Tianlan smiled without saying anything. He just patted him on the shoulder and said in a low voice, "Prepare to watch a good show." In the third night watch period, a good show began. Sitting in the main hall of Kunlun, Lu Chen saw figures flashing outside the hall, and the sound of footsteps. He and perfected Lord Tianlan went up to greet them. Looking at the Dambaldi's expression, it was obvious that he already knew what was going to happen. Before walking to the entrance of the Great Hall, Lu Chen had already made many guesses about the people who might come tonight. The subordinates of the Floating Clouds Agency, Blood Warbler Old Ma, or even some extremely well-hidden shadow. Did they suddenly have something important to report? Or maybe some enemies with bad intentions, such as Supreme Guangbo of Dazai Yard, Supreme Tiehu of Heavenly Law Hall, or even Supreme Guyu of Starry Hall. When everyone's struggle for power and profit had reached the climax, should they draw their swords and fight each other? However, none of this was the case. When Lu Chen saw the people at the door, he felt that his brain was not enough to process it. At the same time, he vaguely felt that what was going to happen this time was probably a little bigger than what he had expected, although he already felt that his expectation was exaggerated. The person who came was of high status and usually kept a low profile, but even when perfected Lord Tianlan saw him, he had to greet him with a smile, cupped his hands, and called him elder brother. His name was Golden Dragon. Perfected Lord Golden Dragon of the 6 perfected lords of Zhengxianmeng. Chapter 645. Zhengxianmeng was the most powerful force in the world, and its greatest asset was, of course, the 6 divine transformation stage perfected cultivators, who were unparalleled in the Immortal Alliance. With these great figures who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world, their powerful subordinates, and the famous sects behind them, Zhengxianmeng could enjoy the limitless glory it had today. However, if a person who knew nothing about Zhengxianmeng had only heard about Zhengxianmeng in the past few years, then 3 to 5 years ago, he would probably think that there was only one big shot in Zhengxianmeng called Perfected Tianlan. But in the past 2 years he might have learned about a few other big shots, such as Perfected Taihu, Perfected Guangbo, and Perfected Guyu. As for the other 2 divine transformation stage perfected cultivators, Perfected Golden Dragon and Perfected Lu Yun, their presence had always been very weak, as if they were a little weaker than the previous 4 divine transformation stage perfected cultivators. Of course, that wasn't the case. True Monarch Golden Dragon and True Monarch Lu Yun were both from prestigious sects, and had the backing of prestigious sections. They also had the assistance of forces that couldn't be underestimated, so they definitely couldn't be underestimated. Of course, no one in the world dared to look down on a divine transformation stage perfected cultivator, except for a certain madman. However, compared to the glorious achievements of perfected Tianlan and Fuyunji, these 2 perfected cultivators were much more ordinary. Of course, in the face of the rare achievement of destroying the devil cult, even Taihu Guangbo and the other famous divine transformation stage perfected cultivators did not have an easy time in the past few years. Actually, everyone was about the same. Only Taihu Guangbo and the others would jump around a few times and make their presence known in front of the world from time to time. At the same time, they would fight for some benefits in the dark, which made people think that their strength was second only to Fuyunji. In terms of age and eloquence, Perfected Golden Dragon was actually the oldest among the 6 perfected cultivators. Unfortunately, the true battle prowess of a deity transformation stage true monarch wasn't judged by how long one lived, and the rise and fall of the major powers had nothing to do with age. In the Vanity Fair of Immortal City and Zhengxianmeng, everyone was very realistic. Whoever could get the most benefits would be the boss. As for things like justice, and so on, everyone just talked about it. When it was time to fight, no one was soft-hearted. Thus, after all these years, true monarch Golden Dragon was actually a person of high status, but the development of his forces was not very satisfactory, and he was slowly being marginalized. Lu Chen had met this true monarch once, and the location was, of course, at the ceremony where he was officially accepted as a disciple by true monarch Tianlan. He remembered very clearly that on that day, almost all the important figures in Zhangxiameng had come. It seemed that everyone gave face to perfected monarch Tianlan, whose power was at its peak. Even if they didn't befriend him, at least they wouldn't turn bad and become enemies, right? It was with this kind of thinking that the Dam Baldi and Lu Chun made a huge fortune at that ceremony. Perfected Golden Dragon was an uninvited guest, but this time perfected monarch Tianlan, who was too lazy to socialize and rude to most people, unexpectedly came to the door to personally welcome him. Then the two exchanged greetings and were very friendly. In the end, perfected monarch Tianlan even held perfected Golden Dragon's arm intimately, and the two of them walked side by side into the main hall of Kunlun. The surrounding servants had already been sent away, leaving only Lu Chun alone in the main hall. Perfected monarch Tianlan also did something even more unfathomable. He directly asked Lu Chun to close all the doors and windows around the main hall, isolating all the curious and prying eyes outside. As a result, the only people in the world who knew about the conversation between the divine transformation stage perfected monarchs were the three people in the main hall. The news quickly spread from Fuyunji. Xue Ying and the other leaders of Fuyunji quickly arrived with their elite troops. They quietly surrounded and guarded the main hall, and at the same time, drove away the spies in the open and in the dark, intentionally or unintentionally, a little further away. These things were done very appropriately and skillfully, because they had done this many times in the past. But this time, there was an additional face in the crowd that was somewhat familiar, but also a little strange at the same time. It was the newly promoted Deputy Hall Master of Fuyunji, Ma Xiaoyan. Actually, there were many people who knew old Ma. Although he was not well known in the past, he had a soft hand in the dark and had a wide circle of friends. Otherwise, he would not have been so well informed, and had been Lu Chen's most reliable source of information for a long time. Because of this, most people in Fuyunji saw Old Ma as being on the same side as Lu Chen. Especially after Lu Chen was accepted as a disciple by Lord Tianlan, Old Ma became the #1 confidant of Lu Chen, the future master of Fuyunji, and his status also rose a lot. However, the world was unpredictable, and it was even more common in a treacherous place like Zhangxianmeng. Old Ma suddenly left Lu Chun and became the deputy hall master of Fuyunji in one fell swoop. This change surprised many people. The deputy hall master of Fuyunji, and it was said that he was also in charge of the affairs of the shadow. He had a high position and power. No matter how they looked at it, it was like the old saying that was used on Lu Chun: reaching the sky in one step. Could it be that people on Lu Chen's side were born with this saying? It was so enviable. Old Ma stood in the crowd with a somewhat complicated expression on his face, as he looked at the tall and grand hall that was currently closed. No one knew what he was thinking at this moment, but he had arranged all the matters at hand without any mistakes. About 5 or 6 feet away from Old Ma, Shuang had a similar expression on her face as she looked at the Kunlun Hall. Her charming face was frowning slightly, and her expression was even more serious. This was because she knew that after today, the rumors that Lu Chen's position was unstable would be discredited. What else could prove how much Supreme Lord Tianlan valued Lu Chen than the fact that a demigod true lord would stay by his side during a private negotiation? Those rumors of discord between master and disciple had been spread for nothing. Shuang sighed sorrowfully in her heart. Looking at the hall, she muttered to herself with some resentment in her heart. My lord, what exactly are you thinking? Could it be that my decades of following and exhausting myself are really not as good as that one Lu Chen? If you continue to force me like this, I really don't know what to do. She thought this in her heart, but she did not show any of it on her face. She stood quietly in front of the Kunlun Hall, just like she had done for the past 10 years. Her back was straight, her face was charming but cold, and she had turned herself into the sharpest blade in Supreme Lord Tianlan's hands, protecting him and blocking all hostility far away from him. However, she still had a feeling that after today, things might be different. Chapter 646. True Lord Golden Dragon was the oldest of the 6 perfected cultivators in Zhangxianmeng, and he was also the most low-key one. Perhaps it was because he was old and had seen too many changes in the ways of the world, but this old man seemed to have become indifferent to many things. He rarely stood out and fought with others for things. Of course, the calmness mentioned above was only relative. In reality, true immortal golden dragon's strength was not weak. Normally, he would be able to get a share of the profits, so his days could be considered quite comfortable. It was only in the last few decades that the madman, true Lord Tianlan, suddenly rose to power and swept across the world with the floating clouds office that he had created. Not only did he defeat the devil cult and the evil path, but in reality, there was also a division of interests within the righteous path's true immortal alliance. When Fuyunji had just developed, these things were not obvious. Most people, including the other perfected cultivators in the divine transformation realm, did not think too highly of this rising star. The true immortal alliance had been established for several thousand years. How many outstanding talents, how many changes in the world, everyone had seen many of them. But no one expected the times to change, and the madman took over. After true Lord Tianlan defeated the devil cult, he came back to steal from the alliance of the righteous faction, not giving them any face at all. To be exact, before Fuyunji defeated the devil cult, they had begun to fight with the forces within Zhangxiameng, both openly and secretly. This did not seem to be a wise move. There were strong enemies outside, and they still had to fight among themselves. It seemed like a suicidal move. But the reality was that the other forces within the Alliance of Immortals all felt the threat of Fuyunji, and they all began to secretly suppress them. This kind of fight was not up to Fuyunji alone. Fortunately, this world, which was supposed to teach the rising star how to behave according to the rules, finally met a madman who did not follow the rules, and this madman was very powerful. True Lord Tianlan and his Fuyunji finally broke the rules, became the boss, and grabbed the biggest piece of the cake. In the face of powerful deterrence, another rule of this world quickly came into play, and that was the survival of the fittest. The other forces in the Alliance of Immortals easily bowed their heads, and everyone lived in peace for the time being. After that fight, true Lord Golden Dragon and the other perfected Lord Luyan kept a low profile and did not show up much. Most of the time, they only said that they were in seclusion. Instead, the other younger perfected lords, such as Guangbo, Taihu and Guyu, were still struggling outside. This was the sequence of events. Speaking of which, true Monarch Gold Dragon was more or less forced by true Monarch Tianlan and his Floating Clouds company. However, on this night in Kunlun Palace, true Monarch Gold Dragon appeared to be very gratified as he chatted happily with true Monarch Tianlan. As the only person in the hall who was watching these two big shots, Lu Chen saw their words and actions as he poured tea, and his heart was not calm either. These two perfected lords of the divine transformation realm seemed to be chatting about their daily lives, and did not mention the general trend of the world. As for the imminent appearance of the blood sea in the sky, they seemed to treat it as if it had never happened and did not exist. They did not mention a word about it. If the people outside saw or heard this scene with their own eyes, they would probably be stunned, because even Lu Chen himself was secretly thinking that these two big shots would probably have a fierce exchange of words, or bargain for the sake of great benefits, or simply plan some terrifying and frightening conspiracy. In the end, none of them happened. True Lord Golden Dragon looked back on his life and the many years he had spent on Mount Celestial Dragon in Zhangxiameng, and he sighed with emotion. Perfected Lord Tianlan repeatedly said yes, and even said that when he had just arrived he had been taken care of by true Lord Golden Dragon. Now that he thought about it, it seemed like a lifetime had passed. True Lord Golden Dragon laughed heartily, saying that he had already seen that perfected Lord Tianlan was a young man with great talent, and that he would definitely achieve great things in the future. Now it had really come true. Perfected Lord Tianlan modestly said that this was all because he had learned from his predecessor, and that he had achieved this little achievement by standing on the shoulders of a giant like his predecessor. Lu Chen couldn't help but cast a sidelong glance at him because his words were so mushy and his manners were so courteous. He thought to himself, could it be that this damnable Baldy has been possessed by a ghost? I've never seen him so courteous to someone in over 10 years. After chatting for a while, true Lord Golden Dragon actually stood up and took his leave. During this time, Lu Chen did not hear anything useful. For a moment, he was also confused by this old man. It was not easy for him to come here, so why did he come? It couldn't really be just for a chat, could it? Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be especially calm. And he sent True Lord Golden Dragon to the door with a smile. However, the moment before the door opened, True Lord Golden Dragon suddenly sighed, looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan, and said, "Sure enough, the new generation excels the old. I didn't expect you to be even calmer than this old man." Lu Chen's spirit was instantly lifted, and he looked at the damn baldy out of the corner of his eye, only to see Perfected Lord Tianlan smiling and saying, "Senior, you flatter me. If you have something to say, please feel free to say it." True Lord Golden Dragon stared at him for a long time, and after a long silence he suddenly opened his mouth. His expression was a little desolate for the first time that night, and he said, "Tonight, I originally wanted to join the game. Whether it was on your side, Tiehu, or Guangbu's side, it would be good if I could get something." Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled without saying anything, and his expression was gentle. Perfected Lord Golden Dragon said indifferently, "Did I tell you that when you suddenly stop being crazy and become polite and considerate, you look even scarier?" This time, Perfected Lord Tianlan was startled, and then he laughed. "That's not true." As he said that, he even turned his head to look at Lu Chun, and said with a smile, "Is that true?" Lu Chun thought for a moment, and then said, "Yes." Perfected Lord Tianlan and Perfected Lord Golden Dragon both looked at Lu Chen's face, and after a while, the two looked at each other and smiled. Perfected Lord Golden Dragon nodded. "Your disciple is not bad." Perfected Lord Tianlan actually had no intention of being polite. He said, "That's true, or else I wouldn't have liked him." Perfected Lord Golden Dragon pointed at him, and then he frowned and said with a solemn expression, "I'll withdraw from Mount Li and Mount Li. I won't take advantage of you, and I won't part with the money. How about it?" Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be surprised at these words, and as if he was getting to know this old man all over again, he sized him up and said, "You actually want to leave? Are your subordinates willing?" Perfected Lord Golden Dragon said indifferently, "I should be the one in charge of the sect. If I say I want to leave, I'll naturally leave. If there's anyone who isn't willing, then don't stay under me." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him for a while, and suddenly asked, "Did you discover something, and that's why you came to find me?" Perfected Lord Golden Dragon smiled. "That's not important. I'm just asking you, my lineage isn't willing to be enemies with you, and I also don't want to stay on this celestial dragon mountain any longer after seeing the terrifying phenomenon in the sky. I want to bring my descendants back to my hometown to live for a few years. There are many implications in this. I wonder if you want to force me to stay as an enemy, or let this old man live." Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a long time, and finally nodded. "There are indeed crouching tigers and hidden dragons among the heroes of the world. You can't underestimate them." With that, he waved his sleeve and bowed solemnly, and said seriously, "Senior, please leave. We'll meet again if fate allows it." Perfected Lord Golden Dragon chuckled, and turned to open the door to leave. However, his voice traveled far, and he said, "Forget it. It's best if I don't see you for the rest of my life." Chapter 647. There are truly too many smart people in this world. Lu Chen thought to himself as he watched true monarch Golden Dragon's departing figure. This was especially true in this immortal city, which was known as the largest city in the world, where the best talents in the world gathered. Those who could climb up from Zhengxiameng were all elites. Those who were not as experienced in the ways of the world would have long been swept away, buried, silent, or died a silent death somewhere. Mount Heavenly Dragon was vast and majestic, but the highest peak was still extremely narrow, small to the point that only a few people could stand. Moreover, the path from the top of the mountain to the bottom of the mountain was already packed with people. There were many precipitous cliffs along the way, and every time one stuck one's head out to look into the deep valley, one would see piles of white bones below, and they were all traces left behind by those who had failed. In terms of the intensity of the struggle for power and profit, Zhengxianmeng was even worse than the devil cult. However, it was in such a fierce and cruel Vanity Fair that true immortal Golden Dragon, who had stood at the top for many years, suddenly retreated. Although Lu Chen could feel from the negotiation just now that this veteran perfected god of transformation seemed to have some other intentions at the beginning. If true immortal Tianlan did not respond well, or if true immortal Golden Dragon sensed some clues that he could take advantage of, perhaps true immortal Golden Dragon would change his face and join the battle ferociously. But now it seemed that all this was just wishful thinking. After a seemingly indifferent chat with true immortal Golden Dragon suddenly made such a big decision and retreated without any hesitation. He even asked for a promise from true immortal Tianlan. Lu Chen didn't know whether true immortal Golden Dragon had sensed some kind of danger, or if he had suddenly been seized by a sudden impulse to look at the surging sea of blood. In short, this big shot had suddenly appeared and left overnight, taking with him a powerful force, and leaving behind an empty space that was enough to make people drool with greed. What should we do? Lu Chen asked true immortal Tianlan beside him. True immortal Tianlan asked in return, "What should we do?" Lu Chen said, "After true immortal Golden Dragon left, he left behind so many properties and profits. Should we rob them?" Snatch. Without any hesitation, perfected Lord Tianlan said in a righteous manner, "There's no reason for us not to rob. The reason why the old man came to inform us was to show him some respect and let him leave unscathed. As for the meat he left behind, it's just our intention. If I don't snatch it, that old man will laugh at me." "Oh." Lu Chen nodded and said, "That's right." Then he paused and said, "How about this? You've been very busy recently, so let me help you with this kind of hard work. How about it?" Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned for a moment, and suddenly sized up Lu Chen. After a while he suddenly chuckled and said, "You're enlightened, lad. It's all because of your guidance. I'm a slow learner and I've disappointed you," Lu Chen said calmly. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed out loud and clapped. "Approved. Let me see what you're capable of. Don't lose to those trash from the other halls." Lu Chen said, "Of course not. However, even the cleverest housewife can't cook a meal without rice. Since you've asked me to do this, shouldn't you at least transfer some of the men from the Floating Clouds Agency to me?" Perfected Lord Tianlan squinted his eyes slightly, but the smile was still on his face. He even clicked his tongue and nodded. "I thought you were going to show me some unparalleled divine power, or some uncanny scheme to complete this great undertaking on your own. Why are you still asking me for men in the end?" Lu Chen said, "I'm not an immortal. Anyway, as long as you give me men and those old soul formation cultivators don't show up, I'll definitely settle this matter for you." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and pondered for a moment. It seemed that he didn't care much about Lu Chen's request. He said, "With me sitting here, if I don't show up, I don't think Tai Hu Guangbo and those other trash will dare to come out and fight for you. So it's probably up to you juniors to rely on your own abilities. Later, I'll give you an order to get a batch of elites from Fuyunji to follow you." Lu Chen said straightforwardly, "Don't go back after you follow me." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with a faint smile. After a moment of silence he said, "Isn't your table manners too ugly?" Lu Chen snorted and said, "In the past I was too concerned about table manners, and was polite in everything. I always thought that there was still a long way to go, so I had to leave some face for now. Unfortunately, they didn't appreciate it. Now that I think about it, I'm really stupid. From the beginning, when you took me in as your disciple, you probably didn't want someone who was tactful and timid, right?" Perfected Lord Tianlan first shook his head, then nodded and said, "Tactful and worldly wise isn't a bad thing. In life, if you blindly advance bravely, you'll only hurt yourself and others. But you're someone who's going to do great things in the future, so you still need to have the courage and the nature of a tiger and wolf." He patted Lu Chen's shoulder with a somewhat gratified look in his eyes. "Fortunately, you finally thought it through." When Perfected Lord Tianlan turned around and walked into the depths of the hall, Lu Chen suddenly said to his back, "Shuang should still be loyal to you." Perfected Lord Tianlan's footsteps paused for a moment, but he didn't turn around. He only asked calmly, "Why do you suddenly say that?" As he spoke, he seemed to have thought of something. After pondering for a moment, he said, I remember that recently, you and Shuang seem to be at odds with each other. Why are you speaking up for her today? Lu Chen said. These are two separate matters. I just want to say that I'll naturally do what I have to do. But doing this is equivalent to dividing Shui Ying's authority. Will she have any reaction? It's fine if she hates me. But if she's dissatisfied with you, have you thought it through? Perfected Lord Tianlan fell silent. After a while, he finally turned around again and looked at Lu Chen with a deep gaze. He said, Why does it sound like you're trying to sow discord? A little. Lu Chen actually admitted it in an unusually frank manner. From his expression, he didn't seem to mind at all. He said, But you can't deny that what I said is the truth. Shuang has been with you for more than 20 years and is your closest confidant. I didn't think that I would become a fool in the end. Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned and looked at Lu Chen. What are you trying to say? Lu Chen met his gaze and walked up to him. Are you suspicious of her and are purposely trying to reduce her authority? His voice wasn't too loud, but his words were still very clear. The hall was silent for a while. Then, Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled with a somewhat emotional expression. Even Shuang doesn't dare to speak to me like that. Lu Chen said. So you took me in as your disciple. Perfected Lord Tianlan couldn't help but laugh. The atmosphere in the hall immediately relaxed. He looked at Lu Chen and turned to leave with a smile. He didn't reply to Lu Chen's question. It was just that after a while, a low voice came from the direction of Perfected Lord Tianlan's figure. I heard that in the past 10 years, there have been many new people in Fuyunji who only know Hall Master Shui, but not Perfected Lord Tianlan. Lu Chen stood in the empty hall and silently lowered his head. After a long time, his lonely body trembled slightly. Chapter 648. Many people had seen true immortal Gold Dragon go to Fuyunji's territory and meet true immortal Tianlan in the main hall of Kunlun. However, the cunning true immortal Tianlan did not let those spies have a good time and talk behind closed doors. Except for Lu Chen, no one else knew the details. This also caused the other forces on Mount Celestial Dragon to speculate. There were all kinds of speculations. Did the two big shots fall out, collude, or fight for power? Everyone was thinking about all kinds of possibilities. But soon true immortal Gold Dragon, who was unusually agile this time, made a decision and action that shocked the entire Zhengxianmeng. He was retiring and returning to his hometown. Of course, this was a joke, but true immortal Gold Dragon really announced to the public that he was old and weak, and that he missed his hometown. He was going to leave Mount Celestial Dragon and return to his home sect, along with a large group of subordinates. Zhengxianmeng was not the imperial court of the secular world, and true immortal Gold Dragon was not an ordinary person. In the world of cultivation, how could a divinity transformation stage perfected cultivator like him retire and return to his hometown? There must be something fishy about it. Everyone immediately realized this, but for the time being, apart from those involved, no one knew the truth. With such a great force leaving, the power vacuum and various benefits left behind were enough to make people salivate. Everyone could only be happy, so how could they go back to stop it? Therefore, all the famous people came out to sing praises for true immortal Gold Dragon, saying that he had worked hard these years, and that it was time for him to go home and enjoy his old age. The rest of the troublesome work, and the work of fighting for the justice of the world, should be left to the young people. Of course, there were also different voices of opposition in the True Immortal Alliance. Most of them came from True Immortal Golden Dragon's own forces. Among them, there were many young talents who were in high spirits. How could they be willing to leave the center of power, the world's largest Vanity Fair, the most flourishing, dazzling, and bewitching city of luxury? Thus, he jumped out and strongly objected. True Immortal Gold Dragon used a very straightforward method to suppress these disharmonious youngsters who didn't agree with his boss. If I say I'm leaving, I'm leaving. If you don't listen, I'll beat you until you listen. If you don't listen, I'll break up with you. Our fate ends here. Don't follow me after I leave. Go with someone else. This caused quite a commotion. After all, the human heart was full of desires. Everyone wanted to climb up as fast as they could. You true immortal golden dragon have been in that position for so many years. Presumably, you've enjoyed everything you can. If you want to retreat now, no one will care. But if you want to retreat, so be it. If you insist on blocking someone else's path, then you are an enemy. As a result, there was a lot of commotion, chaos, and everyone went to their own homes. In the end, Golden Dragon True Monarch left Celestial Dragon Mountain with half of his followers, while the rest were quickly divided up by the other forces. From this, it could be seen that although the Zhengxianmeng organization was terrifyingly powerful, in terms of internal cohesion, it really couldn't compare to those famous sects that had thousands of years of inheritance. There were too many opportunistic and scheming people. Everyone was smart and had their own ideals to fight for. The forces under a divine transformation stage True Monarch were once powerful, but once they decided to retreat, they would instantly shrink by half. This was like an ugly beach that had been exposed after the tide had receded, naked in front of the whole world. The blood sea anomaly in the sky didn't stop. It was still spreading and pressing toward the sky above the immortal city. However, the phenomenon this time was completely different from the previous ones. At the same time, the invisible resistance seemed to be far stronger than before. After a few days, the torrential sea of blood still covered less than half of the sky, and its speed was much slower than the previous ones. But no one knew if there would be a next time after this blood sea anomaly. Perhaps the sky above their heads would never be able to see the original light again? When such a terrifying and strange anomaly was happening above their heads, the atmosphere on Celestial Dragon Mountain in the Immortal City didn't change much. It seemed that too many people didn't care about the atmosphere of the apocalypse. In their eyes, fame and fortune were more important. After defeating the devil cult, the whole world and the vast land of the divine continent were invincible. On the towering Celestial Dragon Mountain, these cultivators who stood at the peak of the human race finally fought among themselves. Humans were really animals that loved infighting. Perhaps seeing the blood of their own kind would make most people excited. Lu Chen felt that he was about to become such a person. He led a group of Fuyunji elites to fight and kill for the interests of those empty foundations in Celestial Dragon Mountain, the Immortal City, and even in various dark corners. He clearly felt that recently, everyone seemed to have become more aggressive. It was probably because they didn't care much about their face for the sake of benefits. That thing is mine, no one else is allowed to touch it. If you touch my things, I'll take your life. Therefore, the Immortal City began to bleed and die. Even if the blood sea anomaly above their heads had not yet closed, and the doomsday had not yet arrived, people had already begun to kill each other. Lu Chen felt very funny in his heart. Then he performed the best and most valiant in the infighting. Under his excellent leadership and performance, Fuyunji once again showed its powerful strength in the infighting in Zhengxianmeng. It repeatedly defeated those who were sent to fight for territory and interests, such as Heavenly Law Hall, Dezayuan, and Starry Hall, making him famous. This was because the number of people assigned to him was, at most, less than half of the Floating Clouds Company's elites. In other words, Lu Chen had led half of his people to utterly defeat the other halls, seizing the biggest piece of cake in this bandit's feast. His performance was very outstanding. He commanded calmly, he was fearless of life and death. He even personally killed several people in front of others. When he used the blade or even his hand to stab the enemy's chest, there seemed to be a smile on his face sometimes. Among the Floating Cloud Service's men who followed him, there were quite a few who vividly described the scene at that time. Afterwards, they said with certainty that Lu Chen's expression at that time was very similar to True Lord Tianlan's when he was young. It was even possible to say that they were carved from the same mold. This sentence was really memorable, and it quickly spread throughout the whole of Fuyunji and Zhengxianmeng. When the overall situation was almost settled, Supreme Tianlan completely ignored the other infuriated good-for-nothings and publicly praised Lu Chen. He laughed out loud and unceremoniously gave most of the properties that he had robbed to Lu Chen, and then assigned those subordinates to Lu Chen. In the blink of an eye, the strength in Lu Chen's hands was already vaguely similar to that of the second Fuyunji. In Zhengxianmeng, who else could be a match for such a terrifying Supreme Tianlan and Fuyunji? If one could not do it, then the people who were stimulated could only speed up the pace of the alliance. The atmosphere became more and more tense, like a surging sea of blood in the sky that was slowly but gradually approaching a desperate situation. A bloody smell grew thicker and thicker on Mount Celestial Dragon. Even many years later, when the survivors who had experienced that scene recalled it, they would find it strange. There were so many cultivators, so many smart people, but why were all of them so bloodthirsty and excited? Chapter 649. Looking down from the top of the Celestial Dragon Mountain, one could see the bustling immortal city as far as the eye could see. At a glance, there were endless layers of pavilions that seemed to extend beyond one's sight to the horizon. Even the people who lived in the biggest city in the world all year round could not help but sigh at the magnificence of this city again. This was the biggest center of power in the world, and also the biggest Vanity Fair in the world. It was something that countless cultivators dreamed of. No matter what kind of request it was, it could be realized in this city. Of course, it was just a possibility. Cultivators were also human, and they also had desires and emotions. When Old Ma stood on the top of the mountain and looked down, he had a similar feeling in his heart. Now Old Ma could be considered to have experienced the feeling of reaching the sky in one step. Perhaps the height of this climb was still a little lower than Lu Chen's, but it did not matter. The position of the deputy chief of Fuyunji was already a position that countless ordinary cultivators in Zhangxianmeng dreamed of. His fat body stood on the mountain. When the mountain breeze blew, perhaps he did not have the elegant bearing of a tree in the wind, but Old Ma himself felt very good. He should be a little more handsome than before, right? Then, he pursed his lips and revealed a slightly bitter smile where no one could see. The city at the foot of the mountain looked quiet and peaceful, and it was as prosperous as before. However, as a high-level person who had obtained a certain status, Old Ma also knew more secrets and news than before. He knew that under the peace, there was a bloodshed slowly spreading. The atmosphere on the Celestial Dragon Mountain was still relatively calm, but the few important halls actually did not interact much with each other. Everyone kept their distance, and when they met on the road, their eyes were filled with vigilance and hostility, lest this inexplicable and gradually fierce civil war suddenly spread to them. Yes, in the seemingly peaceful Zhangxianmeng, even though everyone acted as if nothing had happened, in fact, this could no longer be considered an ordinary dispute in the immortal city, but a fierce battle in the dark. Although bleeding, injuries, and broken limbs looked terrible, it was still within the scope of control. However, in the immortal city, in order to fight for the power vacuum after true Lord Golden Dragon left, the battle soon developed to the point of death. Everyone was a cultivator, an elite, very strong, and also very smart. By the way, everyone seemed to be in a bad mood recently. There was a stifling feeling in their hearts, and they always wanted a place to vent it. Normally, they were all under the same true immortal alliance, so they had to take into consideration their faces and the forces of the various halls. None of them dared to act recklessly. However, in the past few days, all the people under the halls seemed to have suddenly discovered a frightening fact. That was, it seemed that killing people was no big deal. After the first person died, the scale of this battle began to expand rapidly. Everyone's attacks became fiercer and fiercer. Every slash was not to scare people away, but to really want to see blood and kill people. Sometimes, even people who were usually more gentle could not help but become cruel and ruthless killers under such an atmosphere. In this chaotic battle, Fuyunji relied on its own powerful strength to gain the upper hand. At the same time, many people also saw the performance of the future successor of true Lord Tianlan. Lu Chen looked like a killer among killers. Old Ma heard a lot about Lu Chen's performance during this period of time, and he was a little worried about it. For some reason he felt that something was not quite right, but he could not put his finger on it. He only felt that Lu Chen had been with him for many years. At least, the Lu Chen he knew in the past should not be such a person. But Old Ma was not completely sure in his heart, because he also knew more deeply than others that Lu Chen was once the best shadow in the world. This person could even completely change himself into another person when needed, including his personality. He used this powerful and terrifying ability to severely damage the Devil Sect. and laid the foundation for the destruction of the devil sect. Therefore, although Old Ma felt that something was not quite right, he still could not be sure whether Lu Chen was still pretending or not. This person, even his old friends of more than 10 to 20 years, did not dare to say that they could completely recognize him. How scary was that? Old Ma shook his head, and the worry on his face deepened. The road under the city in the distance, on the ancient road leading to the outside of the immortal city, now looked very lively, and it looked like a contrast with the bustling immortal city. But most of the people walking on the road, the densely packed people, were people who were in a hurry to leave. There was an inexplicable and strange phenomenon above their heads. In this city on the ground, there were fights and killings every 2 or 3 days. You could even see blood splattering and corpses everywhere in the streets. This kind of place was suitable for ambitious people and adventurers, not for ordinary people who wanted to live in peace. Old Ma sighed and sat down on the spot. He had stood in this place for a long time, and also waited for a long time. Places that were rarely visited were usually places with extremely dangerous peaks or harsh environments. Perhaps such places would occasionally have beautiful scenery, but after a long time, it was actually very uncomfortable. Damn it! Old Ma muttered, as if he was cursing, but also as if he was complaining about something. After a while he sighed and seemed to be a little discouraged. At this moment of silence, even the mountain breeze suddenly became a little quiet. Old Ma narrowed his eyes slightly and looked into the distance. Suddenly he only felt a pain on his back, as if a hard object had suddenly pressed against his back. Unbeknownst to anyone, there was something so close to him. In an instant, Old Ma's face turned pale. His fat body suddenly tightened at this moment, and his spiritual power suddenly gathered. When he saw that the strength he had hidden for many years was about to burst out in an instant, the words behind his back were like a basin of cold water poured over his whole body. Lu Chen asked me to say hello to you. The voice was low but soft, and it sounded like a woman. At the same time, the hard object seemed to be particularly sharp, and it instantly pierced through his clothes and went straight to his back. Old Ma seemed to be frozen. He stood stiffly in the same place and did not dare to look back. The expression on his face looked very strange. After a moment of silence he whispered, "Lu Chen?" "Yes. What are you going to do?" Old Ma asked. "Kill you," the person behind him said, and the tone of the voice seemed to have changed again. Old Ma sighed and said, "If you want to kill me, just kill me. Why do you have to pretend to be him?" The person behind him made a sound of surprise and said, "Didn't you just betray him? Is it wrong for Lu Chen to want to kill you?" Old Ma shook his head and said, "He won't kill me, and he didn't send you." The person behind him was silent. Old Ma smiled bitterly, then slowly took a step forward, letting his body slowly move away from the sharp blade on his back. Only then did he turn his head to look at the charming woman behind him. He smiled bitterly and said, "That's right, Old Ma. Miss Song, you will scare me to death by doing this." Chapter 650. I didn't expect it to be you. Song Wenji, the most cherished adopted daughter of the first seat of Heavenly Law Hall Immortal Tiehu, who was known for her enchanting beauty and at the same time, was also an outstanding talent of the young generation in the union of true immortals. Standing behind Old Ma, she looked at him, frowned slightly and suddenly said such a sentence. Old Ma didn't seem to be surprised or angry at Song Wenji's somewhat brainless words. He even nodded and said, "More or less, I also didn't expect it to be you." Song Wenji didn't say anything. Her beautiful eyes flickered and stared at the fat face of Old Ma, her gaze as sharp as a knife. Old Ma took a step back and raised his hands as if to express his helplessness and harmlessness. He said, all right, I didn't mean anything else." Song Wenji snorted and put away a strange weapon in her hand. Old Ma took advantage of this gap and secretly glanced at her hand. In that hasty glance, he felt that the weapon seemed to be a bit like a strange hook. But Song Wenji's movements were very fast. That weapon disappeared from her hand in an instant, and no one knew where it went. Why not Lu Chen? Song Wenji sneered and looked at Old Ma with a bit of ridicule in her eyes. She said, "Could it be that the person he trusts the most is you? It seems that Lu Chen is just a chess piece on the surface." Old Ma shook his head and said seriously, "How can we guess the thoughts of that person?" Song Wenji curled her lips and looked as if she didn't care. Then she said, "All right, let's not talk nonsense. What does that person want from me?" Old Ma took out a sealed envelope from his bosom and handed it to her. He said, "He didn't tell me either. He just gave me this letter and asked me to pass it to you. He said that you would know what to do after reading it." Song Wenji's expression changed slightly. She stared at the letter for a moment and was about to reach out to take it when she suddenly retracted her hand. She then took out a pair of thin leather gloves from her bosom and put them on. Only then did she solemnly receive the letter. He looked as if he was facing a formidable enemy, as if he was afraid that the letter would be laced with poison, or that the thin letter contained some extremely dangerous and frightening mechanism. Old Ma was also a little stunned. After a while he couldn't help but say, "It can't be like this, right?" Song Wenji glanced at him indifferently and said, "If you say it's not necessary, then it's not necessary. I'm not familiar with you. Besides, who knows if you've colluded with someone in secret to harm me?" Old Ma was speechless. He just waved his hand and said nothing. Song Wenji carefully opened the letter and took out a piece of paper from the envelope. She was very careful throughout the process, but things were just as Old Ma said. Nothing happened. Song Wenji remained calm and composed. She didn't feel embarrassed at all. On the contrary, she even took 2 steps back, further away from Old Ma. Only then did she open the letter and read it, looking like she didn't believe anyone at all. Old Ma also felt helpless. He thought about it and decided to show that he didn't have any ulterior motives, so he simply took a few steps back. Song Wenji was originally about to read the letter, but at this time, she slightly raised her eyes to look at him. But that was all. She didn't show any other expression on this charming woman. Then her gaze focused on the letter and she carefully read it. Old Ma had the letter for a long time, but he really didn't peek at what was written on the letter along the way. First, he didn't have this intention, and second, he really didn't dare to. But this matter clearly showed that what was written in the letter was the most important. So he also stared at Song Wenji, wanting to see something from her expression. But from beginning to end, Song Wenji's expression didn't change at all. It was as if she had just finished reading an ordinary letter that didn't matter. After she finished reading, she silently folded the letter with her thin leather-gloved hands, and then she rubbed her hands a few times. Suddenly, a flame emerged from her palms. Green smoke rose, and the paper was ignited. Old Ma subconsciously took a step forward. Song Wenji raised her head and looked at him. Old Ma immediately stopped and spread his hands to show that he didn't have any ulterior motives. Song Wenji faintly looked at him. The flame on her palms burned very quickly, and soon, the entire letter was swallowed up, and all the words on it were burned to ashes. The woman let go of her hands, and the flame dimmed. The ashes drifted away with the wind, and the disappeared words turned into nothingness, scattered between heaven and earth, and could no longer be found. Old Ma looked at her, and suddenly felt that the scene in front of him seemed a little familiar. It seemed like the young man from many years ago. They both stood in the dark shadows, silently and alone. In an environment that ordinary people might go crazy, they persevered and tenaciously lived. Sometimes, even Old Ma himself would wonder what supported such a person. "I'm leaving," Song Wenji said very casually, as if nothing had happened before. "It's almost dawn." When she left, she seemed to say this with some emotion, and there was a bit of a gratified look on her face. Then, she really left this place, and didn't look back along the way. Old Ma stood where he was for a while, and then looked up at the sky. He saw the sea of blood in the sky, rolling and gloomy, still pressing towards the center of the city. The sky would only get darker and darker, and there was no sign of it getting brighter. Old Ma sighed, and turned to look at the ancient roads at the edge of the immortal city in the distance. He looked at the people who were still leaving the bustling city in an endless stream, and said to himself in a low voice, "It's not that Master doesn't trust him, maybe he wants to protect him. As for me," his voice gradually became lower, and there was a bit of self-mockery on his face. His voice didn't sound too real. In the end, Lu Chen still felt that there seemed to be something wrong with him. The reason why he only realized it after a long time was because he finally realized that there seemed to be an important person missing from his side. In the past days, that seemingly useless fatty was actually the only one who would tell him the truth and give him timely advice. Now that he was gone, in this period of time, Lucien felt like he had returned to the feeling of being in the devil's sect in the past. He let go of the shackles in his heart and looked down on life and death more and more. His attacks became heavier and heavier, and killing became easier and easier. Moreover, after killing, he would get a faint sense of pleasure. This was something that he had never encountered when he was in the devil's sect. Atsu woke him up. One morning when he woke up, the first thing he saw was a pair of bloodthirsty red eyes. Lucien was shocked, and then suddenly, as if he was enlightened, he suddenly woke up from his trance. The events of the past few days quickly floated up in his mind, and then he broke out in a cold sweat from the shock. What the hell? Chapter 651. The pair of bloodthirsty, strange and ferocious-looking eyes were, of course, not a real evil spirit, nor was it a prank played in front of Lucien with a mirror. It was the black dog lying beside him, looking at him. Lucien was the person who knew Atsu the best in the world. After all, they had been together for so many years. Lucien knew that Atsu had many secrets that others did not know. For example, the black dog's bloodline as a divine beast, the process of its transformation into a holy beast, the green light that flashed in the depths of Atsu's eyes in the dark of the night, and the fact that after a life and death crisis, Atsu became the second existence in the world to possess the power of black fire. Yes, Lucien had never told anyone about Atsu's secrets, not even to the people who were once closest to him, Tianlan and Old Ma. Perhaps somewhere in his heart, he knew that at the last moment, the one who was most likely to be by his side was this black dog. But for so many years, Lucien had never seen Atsu's eyes shining with such a bright red light. They looked like two pools of blood, giving people a bloodthirsty desire. Lucien's heart trembled, and he subconsciously clenched his fists. At this moment he seemed to suddenly wake up from a dream, only to find that he did not realize that he had been in a dream. Since when did this feeling start? Lucien slowly sat up and thought silently for a while. Then he turned his head to stare at Atsu again. Soon he found that although there was a strange red in Atsu's eyes, the dog's mental state did not seem to be affected much. It was not the kind of bloodthirsty monster that would rush up and bite any living creature to death, then drink its blood and eat its flesh. It looked no different from before. The strange smell of blood dyed Atsu's eyes red, but it did not affect its mind. Lucien reached out and hugged Atsu, gently stroking its head. Although what he had experienced this time was very strange, he had indeed experienced too many things in the past years. In fact, similar things had happened in his memories. Atsu seemed to be particularly resistant to such strange attacks that could affect one's mind. Not to mention ordinary beasts, even most human cultivators were no match for it. There was nothing much to explain about this kind of powerful potential. If it had to be said, it could probably only be attributed to the powerful and abnormal divine beast bloodline in Atsu's body. Lucien even suspected that Atsu had something to do with his sudden awakening this morning, although he didn't know what Atsu had done. However, when he carefully thought about it, scenes began to emerge in his mind. In his memory, he had done a lot of things. If it was really a dream, Lucien probably remembered that he had once incarnated into a godlike figure, leading a large group of subordinates to fight unhindered. Blood flowed everywhere, as if it had smeared the entire huge city. Huh? Was the fight that fierce? Lucien sat on the bed, and was stunned for a moment. He felt that his mind seemed to be a little confused. He vaguely remembered that he had led a group of elites of the Floating Clouds Company to fight against the people of the other halls in order to help true Lord Tianlan fight for his territory. However, this kind of fight was definitely a small-scale one, and it might not even be something that could be seen in public. Casualties were unavoidable, but there definitely wouldn't be any large-scale casualties. But why did it seem that in his memory, there were corpses everywhere and blood flowed? It seemed that something was not quite right. Lucien felt it, but for the time being he couldn't figure it out. He shook his head, thinking that this inexplicable strange thing was very dangerous. Even he didn't know that he had fallen into a trap. Obviously, there was some terrible trap or strange thing around. Even if what he thought before might be an illusion, the thing that could produce such an illusion was also extremely terrifying. It should be known that it could even affect the mind of a cultivator like Lu Chun. Although Lu Chun had always been strong-willed and calm, at this time, the first person he thought of was still Supreme Tianlan. That damn Baldy should be able to see through the strangeness of this and solve these strange problems, right? Thinking of this, Lu Chen's originally somewhat uneasy heart suddenly calmed down a lot. He quickly felt the change in his mood. Although he was still vigilant for a moment, he couldn't help but feel a little funny. Why did he suddenly feel like he had suddenly returned to his childhood? He was still the child who held the damn Baldy's hand? He believed in him like that. Lu Chen shook his head gently and laughed somewhat self-deprecatingly. Just as he was about to turn over and get off the bed, his body suddenly stiffened the moment his feet touched the floor, and he stopped moving. At that moment, there was a sudden tumble in his mind, and actually more images came surging out. It was a scene that was even more intense and bloody. He led his men to victory in the battle for the territory of the Immortal City. And when Fuyunji became even more arrogant and insufferably arrogant, for some unknown reason, the scale of this battle gradually began to expand. Originally, at this time, the big bosses of the various mountains in Zhengxianmeng, which were the few divine transformation perfected lords, should have appeared. Everyone would look at their respective profits and the number of casualties, and then they would sit down and have a good chat based on the current territory division, bargaining like businessmen. At most, they would each take a step back. Everyone would look good, and everyone would get some benefits. Then, everyone would be happy, and the world would be at peace. But this time there was actually no such thing. The few divine transformation perfected lords actually did not appear. Therefore, the blood that flowed became redder and redder, and more people died. The situation gradually began to get out of control. In Lu Chen's memory, the clearest image was that the world seemed to always be red, as if it had been smeared with blood. He remembered that he went to find perfected Lord Tianlan for the last time, but he forgot what exactly he said. The only thing he remembered was that perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be looking at him with deep meaning, and that pair of eyes that were as deep as the sea was shining with a strange light. He finally said, "It's almost daybreak." The fur on Atsa's body was still as soft and smooth as he remembered. Its body was still leaning against Lu Chen's side, and the place within reach was still warm. This was perhaps the only thing that Lu Chen felt somewhat comforted at this moment. His mind was in a mess, as if it was in a mess. Countless images seemed to be fragmented and mixed together, making it difficult for him to distinguish them. Only the last sentence that perfected Lord Tianlan said to him in his memory, that it's almost daybreak, was becoming clearer and clearer in his mind, and the echo was getting louder and louder. Dawn is coming? Lu Chen lowered his head and thought for a long time. Then he suddenly stood up and with a cold expression, he strode to the door of the house. After taking a deep breath, he suddenly pulled hard, and the door opened with a squeak. Then he walked out. The sky was dark red, gloomy, like a tumbling sea of blood. There was no sign of daybreak at all. At some point in time, the world had actually been completely swallowed by a sea of blood. Chapter 652. When the sky full of red light sprinkled down and shone on Lu Chen's body, he couldn't help but be dazed for a moment. At that moment, as if he had suddenly received some kind of stimulation, the black fire in the depths of his body suddenly ignited. Like a wave, it rapidly surged through the meridians in his body and washed through them. Then, the strange aura that he hadn't even noticed before had invaded his body was instantly incinerated. Lu Chen's body shook slightly and his eyes immediately regained clarity. It was also at this moment that he finally completely woke up. This night had been very long, so long that he was almost unable to wake up from his dream. It was also at this moment that those memories that were almost hidden finally began to slowly surface in his clear mind. He hadn't forgotten those things that happened a long time ago. He still remembered those things that happened recently. It was as if although he looked no different from an ordinary person before, he had lost his memories like a walking corpse. He was still that person but not complete. The battle in Immortal City became more and more intense after the appearance of the Blood Sea. And under the circumstances that the few divine transformation perfected lords didn't come out to stop it for some reason, the situation began to go out of control day by day. The fighting between the several parties became more and more bloody and tragic, and more people died. Everyone gradually became bloodshot. At the same time, after Golden Dragon Perfected Lord took the lead to withdraw from the battle, and left Immortal City, another big shot who had been silent for a long time, Perfected Lord Lu Yun also seemed to be unable to bear the pressure of the impending storm. Following Golden Dragon Perfected Lord's example, he also led his subordinates out of Immortal City, the center of the world's power. In this way, there was another delicious piece of meat. The parties in the battle swarmed forward and fought even more fiercely. Lu Chen looked up at the sky, his expression cold and somber. Although he didn't know why the power of the black fire in his body would suddenly awaken and expel that strange power at this time, the most important thing was that he had regained consciousness. And once he regained consciousness, it didn't take Lu Chen much effort to notice that there was clearly something strange about the current situation. Of course, this couldn't be a simple internal conflict in Zhengxianmeng. It was an internal conflict between the big forces represented by the divine transformation, perfected lords for territory. As long as there was something wrong with their brains, they would be able to see that although this was intense, it was not in line with the actual interests of those big shots. Zhengxianmeng was a great flag that represented justice and righteousness. It represented the moral high ground of justice. Everyone stood under this great flag and said, "You are an evil demon, I will punish you on behalf of justice." Naturally, the opponent would flee in defeat. Not to mention fighting back, it would be difficult for them to even talk back. Wasn't it the best time to live such a beautiful and relaxing life where everyone ruled over the world? Other than a lunatic, who would want to completely destroy the banner of Zhengxianmeng. Crazy. Lu Chen was stunned for a moment, thinking that there really seemed to be a lunatic here. It was impossible to reason with a lunatic, even if the reason was exceptionally clear and obvious. However, a lunatic would not follow the rules, especially when that lunatic had this kind of ability. Then things would become very scary and easily get out of control. However, Lu Chen soon thought of another point that made him puzzled. Even if the damned Baldi was a lunatic and unreasonable, what about the other three divine transformation stage immortals? Could it be that Taihu Guangbo and Guyu had also become lunatics? Madness could be contagious. Lu Chen didn't know why, but when he thought of this, he suddenly felt a little funny, and then he laughed out loud. He looked at the sky, and then at the world that was shrouded in a dark red radiance. The top of Mount Celestial Dragon was dark, with red clouds pressing down and thunder rumbling. From time to time, lightning would burst out from the distant clouds and tear the sky apart. It looked like the end of the world. However, Lu Chen did not look worried or afraid at all. He looked at everything in front of him and shook his head. He thought that if the world was destroyed, then so be it. He had never thought about the people of the world. Although he had done great deeds for the people of the world, such as destroying the devil cult, he did not know when it started, but the idea of fighting for the people of the world, which was instilled in him by the damn Baldi since he was a child, had gradually faded. Perhaps only the damn Baldi was still obsessed with it. "Atsu, let's go," Lu Chen said to Atsu, who was squatting at his feet. Atsu responded in a low voice, stood up and walked forward. Lu Chen glanced at it, and found that the body of this black dog seemed to have grown bigger. He was silent for a moment, sighed and said, "It seems that you have been eating well recently." Atsu turned its head and looked at him. Its eyes were bloodshot, but its gaze was not fierce. Perhaps in this world, only Lu Chen could make it look like this. "Where should I go?" Lu Chen muttered to himself. After a moment he smiled and said, "Forget it, let's go find the damn Baldi. This blood sea anomaly is too strange. Not only does it hurt others, it can also hurt ourselves. I have a feeling that if this goes on, I'm afraid that the people of the Immortal City will go crazy. I have to tell him that he can't go on like this." Atsu did not comment and just followed him. They had woken up from this inexplicable nightmare. What they faced in front of them seemed to be a bigger and more vicious nightmare. and there was no sign of it ending and waking up. However, as he walked, Lu Chen's mind was still a little messy. Even though he had recalled everything that he should remember, even though he felt that he should have returned to being a complete person with the help of the Black Flame's power, he still felt a little confused. But that feeling of loss still surrounded him. He felt that there was still a piece missing in his heart. This feeling was very strange. He couldn't remember, but he always felt that he still remembered something, or rather he should remember something. When countless fragments of the past found their place in his mind, the blank in his memory was like a fog, curled up in a corner, but still lingering. Occasionally, he could see bloodstains on the road in front of him. Lu Chen thought for a moment and remembered that 2 days ago, when the war entered the most chaotic and tragic stage, there seemed to be an assassination here. He looked around. It was very quiet, and there were no enemies or friends. Maybe it was because it was still early, or because everyone was tired. Or could it be that this strange battle had suddenly ended while he was in a dream? He saw the towering and majestic temple of Kunlun from afar. He was in a trance for a moment, and then he suddenly woke up. He shook his head violently and looked up at the blood sea in the sky. His eyes were slightly cold, and then the power of the black fire in his body burned again, instantly dispersing the cold and strange aura. His mind calmed down again, but Lu Chen's heart slowly sank. Things seemed to be worse than he had imagined. He hesitated for a moment, and decided to find true Lord Tianlan first. He brought Atsu into the world, and walked towards the towering temple. Then he found that there seemed to be no guards outside the heavily guarded temple today. It seemed that he really didn't see a single person along the way. It seemed that he was the only person left in this world. Suddenly, he felt a hair-raising chill slowly spread out from his back. Chapter 653. What kind of feeling was that? It was probably the feeling of suddenly wondering if he was still trapped in a dream and hadn't woken up yet. What was worse was that this dream looked so realistic. For a moment, even Lu Chen himself couldn't tell whether he was awake or not. Fortunately, he had Atsu with him. This lazy but loyal black dog had never left him. When Lu Chen subconsciously reached out and stroked Atsu's back, the familiar warmth from the skin of his palm quickly calmed his somewhat throbbing heart. Lu Chen calmed himself down, walked over and hugged Atsu, and whispered, "Fortunately you are still here." Atsu rubbed its head against Lu Chen's hand, then barked at the Kunlun temple not far ahead. Its voice was low and seemed to be a little vigilant. Lu Chen looked at the tall and majestic temple. Under the deep sea of blood and red clouds, the light and shadow intertwined and changed, like a giant standing in front of him. The doors and windows of the temple were closed, making it impossible to see the situation inside. Occasionally there were some gaps, but it was still dark. Lu Chen didn't continue to move forward. He frowned slightly and lowered his head to think for a while. Then he seemed to have made a decision in his heart. He said to Atsu, "Something is a little strange. Let's not go there for the time being. Let's go to other places first." After saying this, Lu Chen turned and left. He didn't look back along the way. Even his pace seemed to have become decisive, as if he had already thought it through in his heart. He had regained his previous firmness and decisiveness. Atsu followed Lu Chen and took a step forward. Suddenly, it turned back to look at the majestic Kunlun temple. A pair of blood-red eyes stared at the darkness in the red clouds. After a while, it suddenly growled, as if to demonstrate, and also as a warning. Then it turned around and trotted, chasing after Lu Chen. After leaving the Kunlun temple, Lu Chen walked down the mountain with Atsu, because the entire sky of the huge celestial dragon mountain was completely covered by the strange sea of blood. The mountain range was also shrouded in a dark red light. It seemed that everywhere was stained with the color of blood. There were layers upon layers of shadows, making one's hair stand on end. But this was not the first time that Lu Chen had seen such a situation. In fact, in his memory, the sea of blood that had appeared in the sky above the immortal city in the past was stronger and more serious each time. At that time, although there was still a gap in the sky that had not been submerged by the sea of blood, Mount Tianlong was basically like this now. The difference was that the phenomenon at that time did not really affect anything. There were still many people walking around Mount Tianlong. At least it looked like a normal human world. But now there was no one. So where did everyone go? When passing by the Fuyunji Temple, which was not too far from the Kunlun Temple, Lu Chen glanced in that direction. In the past, a group of elites led by Shuang were stationed here, and they had made great achievements. They defeated the devil cult, swept away the enemies, and pushed the name of Lord Tianlan's faction and Fuyunji to the peak. The entrance of the hall seemed to be empty as well. There was no one there. Lu Chen did not go near there. He just stood in the distance and stared for a while. His expression became even more solemn, and then he turned and left. The road down the mountain looked the same as before. There was no change, except that it was much more deserted. Like before, there was not a single person in sight. Even the guards that were usually seen were gone. The scenery on both sides of the road looked the same as before. Apart from being dyed with a layer of dark red light, it looked the same as before. The ancient trees were dense, and the branches spread out. Along the way, only the sound of Lu Chen's footsteps could be heard on the stone steps. As he walked, he suddenly frowned, stopped and looked back. The black dog was following behind him. Sensing that he had stopped, it also stopped and looked up at Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked at it, rolled his eyes and said, "You little fella, do you not make a sound when you walk now?" Atsu wagged its tail, and took 2 steps forward. Sure enough, when it stepped on the stone steps of the mountain road, it did not make a sound at all. If one did not see this dog standing here with their own eyes, they might not have noticed it. It gave people the feeling that it was like a lurking and ferocious beast. Lu Chen snorted and shook his head. Just as he was about to step forward, he suddenly felt something and stopped again. He turned to look at a certain spot in the forest next to him. After a while, he suddenly strode in that direction. Atsu was a little puzzled. It looked at Lu Chen's back, not understanding what he was going to do. The moment Lu Chen walked into the forest, the light around him seemed to dim a little, as if the only source of light was blocked by his figure. The forest was very quiet, and there were branches and weeds everywhere. Lu Chen looked around and did not move. He looked like his whole body was standing there like a stone, and even the sound of his breathing was silent. After an unknown period of time, the quiet forest slowly began to change, as if something that had been suppressed by the shock had begun to unfold once again. A small, soft, and low voice was crying somewhere in the grass. If one did not come close, if one was not in this quiet place, it would be very difficult to hear. Lu Chen's eyes lit up. His gaze swept over the grass where the sound came from, and then he walked over. The sound suddenly disappeared, but Lu Chen had already reached into the grass and rummaged around a few times. After a while, he withdrew his hand from the grass, and in his palm, there was a little bird. It was a very small bird, and it looked less than half the size of a palm. Even the feathers on its body were not fully grown. Its eyes were closed, and it curled up in Lu Chen's palm. Its whole body was slightly trembling, but one could still feel the inherent warmth of life from its weak body that seemed like it could break at any time. Lu Chen looked at this small and fragile bird, and the corner of his mouth suddenly showed a trace of a smile. He stood up, held the bird, and turned to walk out of the forest. Atsu squatted on another mountain path, looking a little bored, but after seeing Lu Chen come over, especially when it saw the little bird in his hand, Atsu suddenly became excited. It barked, jumped up, and opened its mouth to bite. With a paw sound, it was Lu Chen who slapped the black dog's head to the side and shouted, "It's not for you to eat." Atsu was a little depressed, and it growled twice, still staring at the bird. The bird's whole body was trembling violently, as if it was about to be scared to death. Lu Chen's eyes were calm, and he stared at the bird in his hand. After a moment he said to Atsu, "Let's go, this bird is the first living thing we saw, at least." He smiled, looked into the distance and walked forward. He said lightly, "At least it proves that we are not the only two alive in this world. Let's go, let's find those who are still alive." Chapter 654. Perhaps the bird was too frightened or too weak, but after it was found by Lu Chen, it almost never struggled. Even when Lu Chen put it in his arms, the bird curled up and remained motionless. However, The slightly narrow and dim environment in his arms made the bird calm down. Perhaps it was the warmth of Lu Chen's body that made the bird feel supported. At least, it didn't tremble like before. It seemed that the little bird had suffered a great shock a few days ago, but Lu Chen silently glanced at Atu, who was following beside him, from the corner of his eyes. This muscular and tall black dog had been guarding him from the moment he woke up. It seemed like Atu had woken up from the nightmare that he had lost his consciousness in the past. Obviously, this black dog was also affected. Its eyes turned blood red. However, Atsu was obviously not like this bird. Its body was basically intact. It seemed that it had survived that unknown mysterious time with ease. It did not lose control of its mind, and even seemed to have evolved a little. Its strength seemed to be a little stronger than in Lu Chen's memory. However, other than facing Lu Chen, there was an obvious murderous aura emanating from him whenever he looked at someone else. From a long time ago, Atsu had not been interested in this kind of ordinary bird food. It would not hunt for it at all. But just now, when Atsu saw the bird and was about to pounce on it, Lu Chen could clearly feel that if he did not stop it, Atsu would probably bite the bird to death. Not to eat its meat, but simply to bite the bird to death. A shadow flashed across Lu Chen's heart. He stretched out his hand and gently touched the head of Atsu, who was walking beside him. Atsu looked back at him with a gentle expression and whispered. However, when paired with its pair of blood-red, fierce eyes, it still made people shudder with fear. The path down the mountain was the same as usual, but today it felt much longer than usual. Perhaps it was because the surroundings were too quiet. While walking, Lu Chen's mind did not stop. Instead, he kept thinking about this strange puzzle that he had encountered. Since he woke up, apart from Atsu and the half-dead bird he had just found, he hadn't seen a single living thing on Mount Tianlong, let alone a living person. So, where did all those people go? Lu Chen could not imagine what kind of power could wipe out all the people on Mount Tianlong. It should be known that the people here were the core and elite forces of Zhengxianmeng. At the same time, they were also the most powerful people in the entire human cultivation world. Was there a force in this world that could annihilate so many powerful cultivators in one fell swoop? It definitely didn't exist in this world. At this moment, Lu Chen suddenly thought of the scene of the fallen god spell that he had seen in the barren valley many years ago. Although he had personally destroyed the god-subduing spell formation, destroyed the 1,000-year plan of the devil cult and inflicted heavy damage to the devil cult, which caused a chain reaction that caused the devil cult to suffer a great loss in the following decades and gradually weakened and perished. However, the unimaginable power that appeared in front of him that day, the grand momentum that was about to come to the world, still often appeared in his nightmares, waking him up from his dreams. Lu Chen shook his head, threw those unpleasant memories out of his mind, and then looked up at the sky. Not to mention, although the vision of the sea of blood in the sky looked very different from the vision caused by the fallen god spell in the night of the barren valley, there were some similarities in the momentum that covered the sky and the sun. They walked on the mountain road for a long time, but there was still a time when they would finish walking. However, along the way, Lu Chen still didn't see a single person. From the top of the mountain to the foot of the mountain, he didn't see a single living person. The situation could no longer be described as strange. It could even be described as terrifying. Could it be that there really was a powerful unknown force that suddenly came to this world, destroyed everything and wiped out all the human clan? Even someone as strong as perfected Lord Tianlong couldn't resist it? But how could that explain that Lu Chen was still alive? Standing at the foot of the mountain, Lu Chen looked back at the tall and majestic Mount Tianlong. He was the only living person along the way. If one day, you were the last person left in the world, how would you feel? This kind of boring question had actually been raised a long time ago, and then many people fantasized with joking or exaggerated emotions. After all, no one believed that such a thing would happen. Lu Chen also heard of this topic, but he never took it to heart, nor did he think about it. But now, along the way, even though there was a shadow of this question looming in his mind, it was only at this moment that this question finally appeared clearly in front of him. Because when he stood at the foot of the mountain and looked around, the bustling immortal city at the foot of Mount Tianlong, with countless wide streets and layers of pavilions and houses, appeared before his eyes. It was deserted, and there was no one in sight. Where did everyone go? Why was he still alive? Facing this terrifying and huge empty city, the first feeling that Lu Chen felt was not fear, but confusion and astonishment. He still couldn't figure it out. If a disaster really happened, what was so special about him that allowed him to survive on Mount Tianlong? The sound of footsteps on the street, which was originally inconspicuous, was exceptionally clear in this place that was as silent as a dead city. Lu Chen frowned and looked around carefully as he walked. Everything seemed to be the same as before. The shops were open, and the pavilions towered, but the people were gone. The sea of blood rolled in the sky above his head, blocking all the light, making the long street look a little dim. Everything around him was dark red. There seemed to be something in the eyes of the light, staring at him from a dark corner. As Lu Chen walked, he suddenly stopped. Atsu, who was following behind him, also stopped. Lu Chen lowered his head and glanced at his bosom. The lapel there trembled slightly a few times. It was the little bird that had originally calmed down and seemed to have fallen asleep in the warmth of his embrace. For some reason, it suddenly woke up, and then its body began to tremble violently. He gently patted it with his hand, trying to appease the bird, but it was of no use at all. Lu Chen thought for a while, then slowly raised his head and looked forward. On the dark red street with a touch of demonic light, a corner in front of him suddenly lit up with spots of green light. After a while, a group of snake-like things crawled out from the corner. The sound of hissing echoed in the silent street, making one's scalp tingle. Lu Chen stared at the monsters in front of him, looking at the snakes, with 3 eyes on their heads. His pupils suddenly shrank, and then he took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "Bloodworms." You're tuning in to the Echoes of the Heart YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.